Welcome back. It is my pleasure now to introduce our next speaker. Dr. Joan Chiao received her PhD in psychology from Harvard University and is currently a cultural neuroscientist in the psychology department at Northwestern University. Dr. Chiao is an authority on social, affective, and cultural neuroscience. Among other topics, she investigates how basic psychological and neural processes underlying social behavior are influenced by various social and cultural factors. So she's also interested in the physiological foundations of selfishness and selflessness. In her research, she uses a variety of paradigms, including functional neuroimaging, event-related potentials, genotyping, and behavioral approaches as well. She has published widely in top peer-reviewed journals and is the editor of a book entitled Cultural Neuroscience: Cultural Influences on Brain Function. Today, she's here to talk with us about cultural neuroscience and the collective good. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Chiao.
I'd like to start by thanking so much Dawn and Crystal for their hospitality and all their efforts and energy in organizing this wonderful colloquium. It has been a real privilege and very much a joy, I think, to hear the different perspectives, the diversity of views regarding the collective good, and it's a very, I think, important and valuable debate and discussion to have. It's one in which every voice kind of needs to be heard to kind of solve these kinds of problems, which affect many, many different types of public policy issues. So I just want to talk today from a behavioral and brain science perspective of what can behavioral and brain scientists bring to the table in terms of understanding collective good problems. So, the predominant approach that I'll take is with the terming cultural neuroscience, but I mean it to say that cultural neuroscience is one, I think, again, of many different diversity of frameworks that people can take to understand this kind of problem. Okay, so I just want to introduce this more generally, okay, and from a historical perspective, that we understand that our physical environments very much influence our thoughts, feelings, beliefs, and desires. Cultural psychologists have demonstrated with very elegant studies numerous occasions, right, where we know that different types of physical environments can modulate behavior. And so you can imagine environments that are more rural or more urban, and just that simple difference of urbanness or ruralness can influence people's psychology. We also know that our values, our practices, beliefs, the things that are invisible, the things that exist as constructions of the mind, but also as constructions from the environment, such as what people value in terms of maybe how they pray or their religious beliefs and practices, also are very diverse across many different geographic regions of the world. So they may maybe even pray to the same God, but they do it in different ways or have different types of clothing or signature. And the goal of this is just to demonstrate that many of these practices have common themes, common goals. They just have slight variability in how people of different groups accomplish these goals. Similarly, even our very basic virtuous beliefs about what is good or bad, right or wrong, what is beautiful or ugly. We see in our physical environments many different types of statues and art, as we've seen in other people's talks, about what signifies or what symbolizes what the society values can very much vary. And those kinds of representations are very diverse and also, I think, demonstrate or serve as a byproduct of the diversity in our mind and our brain. So the idea that people have this diversity of values and beliefs is certainly not new, and this is why I mean it's a historical perspective, right? This dates back all the way to the earliest writings here of Isidore, the Etymologia. In the entry in the Etymologia here describes the cultural diversity as something that exists not only out there in the world, but also as a reflection of people's thoughts, feelings, and beliefs. And similarly, within this etymologia, there also is the oldest world map. And this, I think, is a really important metaphor, I think, for understanding cultural diversity as it maps on the biological levels. Because essentially, what we're trying to do with creating a physical map of the mind and the body is to map on mental states to physical states, right? But we can see that these, just as we are mapping on physical and mental states, it's very possible that these mappings could be impoverished. And so an important task for us, I think, as behavioral and brain scientists, is to understand how is it best to construct accurate and detailed maps of how physical and mental events map onto each other. Okay. Now that's from a historical perspective, but then from a more leadership and collective good perspective, we have to also have an interdisciplinary dialogue about what is at stake in these questions. Why does it matter, to even understand this at an empirical level, at a scientific level? Okay. And so this is where I think, again, this is something where people's independent beliefs about this are very, very important. We have to be able to understand how is this actually going to be valued in society, and what way can this work or knowledge give back, okay? So I think that there are several different domains. Again, there are probably many more than many people can think of, but some of them may, for example, could be global health. So example, we know that there's population health disparities in different regions of the world. We also know that there's racial and ethnic disparities in health. And the question that, population epidemiologists ask all the time is, where do these population health disparities come from? Is it a function of societal infrastructure? Is it a function of differences in biology? And so one of the things that we want to understand is how this cultural and biological diversity maps onto each other, okay? And then how best to create this basic knowledge such that we can help to close the gap, I think, between some of these population health disparities. Similarly, I think even a uniquely American debate is this issue of interethnic ideology, okay? And this is from great work by Chuck Judd and others at the University of Chicago, and they ask, the historical idea of a unifying American identity is now in peril. Okay, instead of a transformative nation with an identity all its own, America in this new light is seen as preservative of diverse alien identities. One wonders, will the center hold, or will the melting pot give way to the Tower of Babel? I think this is an important quote because what it suggests is that as we start to create societies and communities that are truly physically and I think culturally diverse, okay, what does it mean for us to coexist peacefully together? In what ways can we create a community such that people of different types of identities or multicultural identities can equally thrive in a non-zero-sum way, okay? And I think this is related to not only to how man exists in relation to another, but also man's relation to its environment, okay? So for the example of environmental policies, and this is where, again, this is something that's, national, international debates. These are kinds of things that are important for all of us to sort of grapple with. This issue of climate change and sustainable development, right? So how do you create environments in ways where men can exist in peaceful harmony with the environment, and at the same time promote what many of us would consider as virtuous or potentially not virtuous. And I think that these kinds of environmental policies, again, are very, again, require interdisciplinary dialogue to get at, and very much our values, beliefs, and practices, as well as our biological diversity, can influence how we sculpt our values, beliefs, and behavior and related to these kinds of environmental policies. And an issue which I know that Mike will talk about later, this issue of philanthropy and the response to Haiti. So we know that natural disasters occur in many different parts of the world, and it's partly our international responsibility to respond to people in need, right? So the question is, how can we best organize community resources in ways that enable us to give to bring resources where they're most needed, okay? So, I think all of these kinds of broader public policy issues require sort of healthy debates and to understanding how best to solve these kinds of problems. Now, again, as I said, I'm coming at this from a basic science perspective, an empirical researcher, and what I want to do is just show you different ways in which the cultural neuroscience framework from a scientific perspective can provide scientific facts or beliefs that may or may not inform these public policies. Okay, I don't want to take too strong of a stand in saying that, we're going to solve all these crazy problems with this, with the cultural neuroscience framework, but just to suggest that this is an important area of research where we can really bring synergy to cultural and biological diversity issues. Okay, so I'm going to give 3 empirical examples, one in understanding the self, empathy, and emotion, understanding diversity as a product of adaptation from a biologist perspective, and then also from an ideological perspective. So how can we understand diversity in terms of ideology? So colorblindness versus multiculturalism. Okay, so first, just the empirical data. So why would you think that cultural influences, particularly in brain function, examining that, why would that matter? So there's 3 reasons. One is that cultural experience influences brain and behavior. We know that from a lot of empirical research that already exists. Second, cultural variation in brain structure and function may exist even in the absence of cultural differences in behavior. So it could be that we see cultural differences in behavior and they're related to biological differences. It could be that we have biological differences that we don't even see observably in behavior. And that's an interesting and, in fact in its own right, and I'll just explain that with empirical evidence. And then finally, we know that genomic variation exists across cultures. It's much smaller than than any genomic variation. The idea is that the genome is predominantly universal. But we do note that there is some cases where there is genomic variation across cultures, and that 70% of genes are expressed in the brain. So the question is, does this genetic diversity modulate any kinds of biological processes that might influence behavior, or the cultural diversity and behavior that we see? Okay. So this is the reasons. Now I want to explain to you also that, again, people have been thinking about this problem for a long time. So even in this paper by Lee in 2003, she talks about the multiple timescales at which you can see culture and biology interactions. Okay, one is with the microgenesis, this issue of the situation. The second is the lifespan ontogeny, this issue of development. So, how do critical periods influence gene-environment interactions? And then finally, human phylogeny. So how is it the case that culture and biology interacts across slow timescales and very fast timescales? Okay, so and this is the case of human phylogeny. And all of these timescales are very important, and because culture and biology are interacting in multiple timescales, right? So, like I said, this problem has been important for empirical scientists to ask for a long time. And the question is, why introduce a framework of cultural neuroscience to answer these questions? So I'll just say this is something about the sociology, I think, of universities or institutions that are dedicated to creating knowledge to better humanity, okay? We create, academic departments and refine expertise in order to be able to tackle each problem independently. So, for example, anthropology is, is a field of expertise that provides us knowledge about culture. Psychologists predominantly take on the psychological processes underlying human behavior. Neuroscientists predominantly focus on the mechanisms. What are the neural mechanisms underlying behavior? And then finally, molecular biologists have been the ones that have given us this rich source of understanding about genes and how genetics play a role in behavior. Okay. So what cultural neuroscience is basically a framework that integrates across these levels of analysis. Okay, so we're integrating theories and methods from cultural psychology, from social, cognitive, affective neuroscience, and from an exciting new area of neurogenetics. And the neurogenetics area is where people are adopting this neuroimaging technique to basically understand how genes are visualized or expressed in neural processes. And then social, cognitive, and affective neuroscientists are looking at mappings between the mind and the brain. And cultural psychologists are looking at the mappings between culture and the mind. Okay, so it's a very sort of fortuitous and exciting time for us to be able to try to integrate these theories and methods as much as we can. And predominantly the methods adopted by these scientists are culturally appropriate surveys. So there's been decades of research, of rich research dedicated just to refining tools for understanding how can we accurately measure behavioral responses across diverse cultural contexts, right? That's a science in of itself. And it's taken a lot of hard work to develop that, right? And then we have people who have multiple expertise in many different methods, neuroimaging, ERP, TMS, patient population psychophysiology. That in itself is a huge scientific enterprise. And then population genotyping. So people who are examining and documenting population variability at the genomic level. That body of knowledge only began 30 or 40 years ago, right? So this stuff is, this takes a lot of time to get to this point. But the thing is, if we can find ways in which we can interweave these different types of theories and methods, that could potentially help us to understand more clearly how cultural and biological diversity interact in meaningful ways. Okay. So I'm going to predominantly, now just to talk about the methods of cultural neuroscience. This is actually a slide that cognitive neuroscientists have adopted. So this is not something that's, I don't want to be territorial about it or anything, but just to say that, there are always, like any type of empirical method, a scientist will tell you that there are always trade-offs, I think, in different types of techniques. And most cultural people working with, at the interplay of cultural and biological diversity right now are predominantly adopting event-related potentials and functional neuroimaging. No one, to my knowledge, so far has done anything related to patient populations, single-cell recording, multi-unit recordings, or MEG. But it's very possible that other people, who have that kind of expertise may be interested in doing those kinds of experiments. But I focus primarily in this particular talk on neuroimaging because That's my primary methodological area of expertise. And here you can see that even within the neuroimaging field, okay, so this tech, as we know, we've talked about technology, provides us with abilities and innovations, and you can see that from 1990 to 2008, we see this huge growth rate, right, in number of publications that adopt this method of neuroimaging, right? But if you look at the breakdown of the number of published studies, peer-reviewed published studies of neuroimaging, and you compare it to Western and non-Western countries, you can see there's this very large gap, okay? And I think this is pretty much driven by economic factors, economic, technological, scientific, infrastructure factors. It's a case, and it's always been the case, I think, historically, is that with technology innovation, usually it's Western industrialized nations who will be able to create these types of knowledge and infrastructures that enables us to create this kind of scientific evidence. And so that's where you can see this very large gap. Now the question is, does it matter? Okay, does it matter whether who is creating the science? I think that's the other part of this story, right? So the question, it turns out that we do have this researcher bias within the field of neuroimaging, in the sense that most of the publications are coming predominantly from Western industrialized nations, which makes complete sense given the infrastructural capabilities. And what we the cultural neuroscientists are asking is essentially, can we understand cultural diversity with brain function and determine basically whether or not there is cultural diversity in behavior that is mapping onto that cultural diversity in brain function, okay? And so you can see here is we adopt predominantly cross-cultural neuroimaging or transcultural neuroimaging. It's essentially, I would view the same thing. It's non-invasive, it's an indirect measure of brain activity, measures ratio of oxygen to oxygenate of blood. There's temporal resolution differences, so it's a slightly slower method than some other methods that people would adopt, but it controls for signal-to-noise ratio. So essentially, as long as you make sure that whatever your research sites are, that you control for signal-to-noise ratio, that essentially you're able to equally compare neural activity across populations. And this is very important, because if you're looking at cultural differences in biology, right, you want to know the source of the difference if you find one, okay? Especially with neuroimaging, there are so many different data points or voxels that you're measuring from. It's so likely that you could have many different differences that occur for spurious reasons. So you want to make sure that you have a really, really tight methodology when you make these comparisons, because once people find a difference, or they make a difference, or you see a difference in brain activity, the question then is, well, what does it mean, or what's the inference? So I think that it's really important that we develop these methods really carefully and when we are asking these kinds of complex problems. Okay, so now, so we adopt this cross-cultural neuroimaging methodology, and what can we answer from this from a more theoretical perspective, okay? So one of the first questions that we've been looking at is, how does culture influence neurorepresentations of self? And there's very large philosophical evidence that, for example, Western and Eastern regions of the world have adopted different types of philosophy. So, for example, Socrates, predominantly associated with individualism, and Lao Tzu associated with collectivism. So cultural psychologists have created schemas or models that essentially distill this philosophy into what's called self-construal style, okay? So basically, individualists define themselves as autonomous and separate from others. They think of themselves as continuous across situations and contexts. Whereas collectivists are much more likely to think of themselves as interdependent and as relational. So they define themselves by situations and contexts, and it's a much more fluid sense of self, okay? So this has been the predominant, I think, theoretical framework within cultural psychology, and there's been a lot of empirical evidence to support this. Okay, so let me just give you some examples of it. Now, although it is perceived as a dichotomous cultural value system, it's actually very continuous across geographic regions. So you can see here, this is a color map, and essentially, yellow being more individualistic and red being more collectivistic. There's a lot of variability geographically. Okay, and one of the questions from an empirical perspective we're wondering is, what are the origins of this geographic variability? Okay, where does this cultural diversity in individualism and collectivism come from? And that's, I think, one of the core issues of this colloquium, right? series. Okay, so from a neurobiological perspective now, you can ask, well, one of the things we know from an accumulating growing amount of evidence within human neuroscience, and this is from a meta-analysis, that essentially medial regions or cortical midline structures tend to be very responsive to any type of self-reflections or self-processes more generally, okay? So essentially what you can see here is within this region of BA1032, you can see that this particular area of the brain is highly, highly engaged during any type of self-processing, okay? And so that enables us to ask, well, do the cultural values of individualism and collectivism modulate neural activity within this particular region, knowing that we are already that this region is highly sensitive to self-processing? Okay, so you can see here, so what we did was we compared neural activity between 12 Caucasian Americans living in Chicago and 12 native Japanese living in Nagoya, Japan. And here was the task. So in the task, we basically constructed 3 conditions. Basically, in general, I'm independent. In the contextual condition, when talking to my mother, I am casual. And then a font condition, so is this statement, I am truthful, in italics, yes or no, okay? And so basically, this is just a self-judgment task to assess when you're assessing a general or contextual question, can you see neural activity modulated as a function of the general and contextual context? And then outside of the scan or outside of neural measurement, we basically give people a behavioral scale, the self-construal style scale. And for anybody not familiar with it, which I'll just give you some examples of what the individualistic and collectivistic items are. So here, I'm the same person at home as I am at school. That's a very individualistic belief. And then I will sacrifice my self-interest for the group I am. That is a very collectivistic value. And so people typically vary on this scale. And what we found with our set of studies was essentially that this region, which I showed you earlier, this BA1032, showed greater activity to the culturally congruent conditions. So for instance, individualists were much more likely to engage neural activity structures associated with self for the general relative to the contextual questions, whereas collectivists were much more likely to engage medial prefrontal cortex activity to the contextual relative to the general questions, suggesting that neural activity within this specific region is modulated as a function of cultural value system, okay? And from an empirical perspective, this is really data, that you usually will not find as a strong correlation like this, but essentially that you see there here that people who report more collectivism are much more likely to show greater medial prefrontal activity to the contextual relative to the general conditions. Now there is a very interesting point in this graph, and I wonder if any of the empiricists in the room might see this, but so people well, a lot of the literature has suggested that race and culture seem to map on tightly. So for example, if you're racially East Asian, you'd be more likely to be a collectivist. If you're racially Caucasian, you may be more likely to be an individualist. But what our data suggested here was essentially that Americans were showing more collectivistic tendencies, and the Japanese were showing much more greater variability. Okay, so it's not really, I think, from at least within the empirical data we have here, what this is suggesting is that we really need to measure culture as a function of values rather than as ethnicity, because that's essentially what seems to be correlated with the behavioral activity here. Nationality is not necessarily a strong predictor, I think, of these kinds of variabilities in neural responses. Okay, so from a cultural psychological perspective, this tells us that we can measure cultural values. We don't have to even just assume cultural values by virtue of race or nationality. And then not only can we measure cultural values, we can map them onto individual differences and neural responses during self-processing. Okay. Now, from a neuroscientific perspective, this is good because it suggests to us that maybe it does matter that cultural values are taken into account when measuring neural activity, because essentially we could see differential neural activity as a function of cultural values. Okay. So here, in the next study, what we did was now we looked at dynamic cultural values. Okay, so like I said, we know race and nationality are not necessarily strong predictors. Here we were looking at the dynamic nature of cultural values, and we basically adopted a cultural psychological technique of cultural priming. Okay, and this is work done by Ying Hong and colleagues. And what they've done is really elegant studies showing that you can basically prime people, multicultural individuals, into more individualistic or collectivistic fashion and see very pronounced differences behaviorally across a wide range of domains. Okay, and so basically what we did was we adopted the same methods of Ying-Yi Hong and Wendy Gardner, and so I'm going to just give you an example of those particular methods. So in one of them, it's a Sumerian warrior story. So in the individualistic prime, the general chooses a warrior based on his personal achievements and merits. And in the collectivistic prime, it's a general who chooses a warrior because he's a family member and will bring honor to the family. And then all participants just read this and then they respond yes, no, or maybe. And then we also give them a friends and family task. So here, now we try to make it much more self-relevant, okay? So we ask people to write a short essay about what makes you unique from friends and family, or in the collectivistic prime, write a short essay about what you have in common with friends and family. So just simply by just reflecting on what is unique or what is common about oneself, you can prime individualism, collectivism here, okay? And now our question from a neuroscientific perspective, because there's really rich work on this dynamic cultural mind work, is to just ask, do these dynamic cultural value differences map onto biological differences in a dynamic fashion, okay? And so what you can see here is we basically adopted the same task. And this is just to show you the data of the priming, just to show that there were no variabilities in how much people agreed in terms of the individualistic collectivistic prime. It's pretty much, everybody is equally primed, okay? And then here you can see that the priming techniques are very good. So here we have outside raters rate the essays on uniqueness and similarity. So people who write about individualism will be more strongly primed with the individualistic cultural values, and people who write about similarity will be much more primed with the collectivistic values. Okay. And then what we found was, again, these two regions within the cortical midline structures, the MPFC and the PCC, that showed essentially greater activity within these two regions as a function of the cultural congruency between the cultural values and the self-reflection task. So this suggests to us essentially that cultural values are not only something where we can ask people, what are your cultural values, but they're also very much malleable and influenced by situation, or in this case, these essay writing primes. Okay, and then from an empirical for the empiricists in the room, you can see here that that there's a correlation between the degree of activity in the culturally congruent conditions and the degree to which a person was primed. Okay. So what does this suggest to us for cultural psychologists is that cultural priming modulates neural activity during self-processing, even in the absence of the behavioral differences. So we don't see reaction time or accuracy differences, but we do see this neural difference. And that these cultural traits of self-construal style are dynamic, and they can basically exert influence on both macro and micro time scales. Okay, so that the issue of dynamics is very important here. And then also from a brain scientist perspective, it suggests to us that cultural priming as a social psychological method is good at eliciting modulation of neural activity akin to repetition priming. So there is this basic concept in cognitive neuroscience about how people learn, and it's associated with repetition priming. And basically, it just suggests that there's actually congruence within these two literatures between cultural priming and repetition priming. And then actually that this is a way in which people learn specific types of cultural values or beliefs. And so we can see here that both state and trait level self-construal style modulate neural activity during relevant processing. And this work has been replicated by colleagues at Peking University. Okay, so now I want to look at another domain of empathy. So how do cultural values influence our response, our emotional and our altruistic response to other individuals, okay? And this is preliminary work, but I just want to touch on it because it does matter to the larger themes of common good. So how does cultural values influence neural mechanisms of empathy? So individualism and collectivism are one of 5 different dimensions that Hofstede had studied a few decades ago. And in particular, one dimension he was interested in is power distance. So we know that power distance is a cultural variable that also similarly varies geographically. And you can see here it's a continuum across many different areas of the world. So going from more egalitarian to more hierarchical. And we were interested in whether or not hierarchical or egalitarian beliefs essentially modulate neural activity to people suffering. And so you can see here that there's regions of the brain that are highly sensitive to other people's pain. And across a variety of different paradigms, people have reliably shown that essentially if you show people in pain or not in pain, so not pain, pain, and it can be a cartoon or it can be sensory, that essentially you get these regions in the brain, the anterior cingulate and the bilateral insula, that show greater sensitivity when observing people in pain relative to not in pain, okay? So what we did was we first just asked whether or not this difference in these neural activity of the anterior cingulate and bilateral insula, it maps onto differences in cultural value beliefs about power distance. And so here what we did was we showed people pictures of Hurricane Katrina victims and controls, people not in pain, but there's outdoor scenes, and essentially measured neural activity in a block design. And then to measure cultural values of a hierarchy and egalitarianism, we adopted the measure of social dominance orientation, which is a personality measure of hierarchy preference developed by Felicia Prado and Jim Sedanius and collaborators. And this is a really excellent scale because I think it gets to very much to the heart of hierarchy preference and egalitarian preference, okay? So basically, people with a hierarchy preference will agree to questions like some groups of people are simply inferior to others, inferior groups of people should stay in their place. People with more egalitarian preference are going to agree with statements like group equality should be our ideal, it would be good if groups could be equal. So you can see that this is basically a personality measure of hierarchy preference that can get at individual variability in hierarchy preference and egalitarian preference, okay? So what we first did was we just gave people this social dominance orientation scale and then looked to see whether or not individual variability in response to that scale mapped onto neural responses within the anterior cingulate and bilateral insula. And in a first study where we just were looking at Caucasian Americans, we found a very strong correlation or association between social dominance orientation and empathic response. So basically people who are more egalitarian are going to show a much greater empathic response relative to people who are more hierarchy belief. And this would make sense to us, I think, from a theoretical perspective. But had not been observed before. Okay, so now we know that social dominance orientation is a personality or individual difference that can modulate neural activity and neural responses to people of other people suffering, right? And now we wanted to look at it from a cross-cultural perspective. So here we compare 13 Koreans, and this is the work done by Bobby Chiao, a grad student in my lab, and compared with Caucasian Americans. And what he did was he went to Korea and he basically asked, do these cultural differences in social hierarchy map onto neural differences in people's response to suffering? And so what we found was, as predicted, Native Koreans showed greater hierarchy preference relative to Caucasian Americans, which is consistent with the geographic variability we saw earlier. And Caucasian Americans showed slightly more empathy relative to Native Koreans, as you can see here. Everybody shows high rates of, relative rates of empathy, but there's a cultural difference. And then we also looked at dispositional empathy, so empathic concern, perspective taking, fantasy average, and personal distress. And you could see that empathic concern and perspective taking were slightly higher in Caucasian Americans relative to Native Koreans. However, Native Koreans showed greater personal distress relative to Caucasian Americans, okay? And so these different dimensions of empathy show this cultural variability and could help to explain potentially cultural differences in empathy and altruistic response. And we saw that we also looked at the relationship between hierarchy preference and behavioral empathy, and you can see here that there were significant correlations between degree of hierarchy preference and empathy rating, so how much did you feel in response to the suffering of others. And similarly, even when you looked at the relationship between the personality dimension of social dominance orientation and these trait-like measures of perspective taking and personal distress, you can see that there were relations between that as well. Then we looked at the brain. So we were saying, we have this neural response to people suffering. How does it relate to people's preference for hierarchy egalitarianism? And what you can see here is that these three regions, these theoretic hypothesized regions, the anterior cingulate, the bilateral insula, essentially show that there is a greater response within the Caucasian Americans relative to the Native Koreans to people suffering. So it is consistent with the behavioral data suggesting that the individual variability in responses to hierarchy preference mapping onto neural activity, empathic neural activity, is also mapping on cross-culturally. Okay, so you can see that as well. And then we look at correlations between brain activity here and social dominance orientation, and we see the predicted correlation. Okay. So from a cultural psychological perspective, it's important for us to understand how power distance is associated with cultural variation and empathic neural response. And then also from a brain science perspective, it's important to think about how cultural values shape the empathic neural response within these regions. of the brain. And then finally, show you evidence of culture and emotion, okay? So we're originally interested in looking at how culture influences neural processing underlying emotion recognition, and this is work building on the excellent work of Hilary Anger Elfenbein and Nalini Ambady, looking at cross-cultural variability in in-group emotion recognition. And what you can see here is that there was, there was a big debate in the literature about to what extent is the ability to recognize emotions universal or culturally specific. So here you can see, for example, there's a lot of evidence for universality. So facial expressions in blind and deaf children exist even in the absence of the sensory experience, suggesting that there's this innate machinery for producing emotional expressions. There's also the Paul Ekman's excellent work looking at basic facial expressions of emotion. And here you can see that there's 6, possibly 7 basic emotions of expressions of emotion. And we also know that there's cultural differences in emotion. So, for example, there's now growing evidence of in-group advantages in terms of emotion recognition. So people tend to recognize the emotions of members of their own group more than members of others' groups. And there's also differences in display rules. So when is it appropriate or inappropriate to display emotion? How sensitive people are emotionally, cross-cultural contexts. And then what is the ideal affect of the person? So should we have very extreme feelings of emotion or more moderate central feelings of emotion? Okay, and so from a neuroimaging perspective, this was exciting for us because you can see that there's almost no evidence, empirical evidence, of cultural differences in neural responses to emotion recognition. And what you can see here is that essentially across from 1993 to 2003, there were a number of publications in primarily with Caucasian individuals. So, and this makes a lot of sense because from a neuroscience perspective, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that the neural systems underlying emotion recognition are universal. So patients with Urbach-Weiss disease, which have calcification to these evolutionary ancient regions of the amygdala, basically have an inability to accurately recognize fear faces, okay? And so what we did was we looked cross-culturally, comparing Caucasian Americans and native Japanese. And what they did was a simple emotion recognition task. So they look at either unculture fear, anger, happy, or neutral faces, and other culture fear, anger, happy, and neutral faces. And then what we did was a region of interest analysis within the bilateral amygdala, and you can see that both the left and the right amygdala show greater response to own culture relative to other culture fear faces, suggesting that people show this greater biological response to fear expressions when they're expressed by members of their own group. Okay. So what this suggests is, from a cultural psychological perspective, is that cultural specificity exists in emotion recognition behaviorally, and we can see this mapped onto neural responses within the amygdala. And then from a neuroscience perspective, it suggests that even within evolutionary ancient subcortical regions like the amygdala, but we see these variabilities in amygdala response to fear faces, evolutionary adaptive stimuli, just as a function of cultural specificity. Okay, so it could be that amygdala may be part of a larger neural network that facilitates group selection in altruistic behavior. So we know that that there's, this is again a larger program of research, obviously, but it's the case in which people often in times of intergroup conflict will display in-group biases, and it's very possible that essentially this greater preferential response to the suffering, or a suffering signal basically of a person of your own group, can facilitate that intergroup advantage, right? So going from there, we were interested in looking at, well, where did these effects come from? Okay, how do cultural and genetic factors influence amygdala response? And so for that, we were interested in looking at a particular gene, so the serotonin transporter gene. The serotonin transporter gene has there's predominantly 2 variants, a short and a long allele. The short allele is less efficient relative to the long allele. And it's been associated with different facets of emotional health. So for instance, people with the short allele are more likely to self-report greater neuroticism relative to people with the long allele. And then people with the short allele are much more likely to show major depressive episode, but with increasing levels of stress. And this original work by Caspi essentially has led to gene-environment interaction models of understanding the relationship between genes, environment, and how that modulates emotional health. And what's interesting from an imaging genetics perspective is that we know that this particular gene regulates activity within the amygdala. So we know here that, for example, people with the short allele are much more likely to show response to fear faces or to negative stimuli relative to people with the long allele. And so what we did was we compared neural responses within Caucasian Americans, Native Japanese, and Japanese Americans, and looked at their responses to neutral stimuli relative to emotional scenes, and then also a cognitive inhibition task as a measure of cognitive regulation, or a neural assay of cognitive regulation. And what you can see here is that within the left and the right amygdala, that both the left and right amygdala show much greater response in the Native Japanese relative to the Japanese and the Caucasian Americans. Okay, you can see it's a very strong effect here. And no difference in neural activity within the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex in the cognitive inhibition task. Okay, so this suggests to us that there's this very strong difference in emotional response to emotional scenes relative to neutral stimuli, but no difference in the response within the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex during an inhibition task. So this gets us to understanding, well, what is driving the cultural variability in neural responses within the amygdala, right? Why would we see this nearly twofold response in Native Japanese relative to Japanese and Caucasian Americans? So from this, we adopted an evolutionary approach, okay, an evolutionary origins of culture approach. Because from a brain sciences perspective, it's not enough just to look at the neural activity. We don't have a mechanism, we don't have a theory for why that would exist here. And cultural variation in amygdala response exists even when controlling for now this known genetic and cultural factor, right? And we also know that cultural variation is not attributable to scanner site. We were controlling for signal to noise ratio. So, like I said, you know, what is the value of this kind of data? Well, I think it helps us to bridge gaps, I think, between different theoretical discussions about human behavior and its relationship to biology. And essentially, Norazin and Hein have argued that really there's kind of four major types of cultural variability in behavior, okay? Accessibility, functional, existential, and non-universal. That's what they've got. And there's three different criteria for the spectrum of universality. And different types of behavioral capacities of humans map onto these different levels of cultural specificity. So you can see really behavior as a continuum going from strong universalism to weak universalism, okay? And now what we're doing by looking at the neural level is basically mapping on different levels of analysis to this same type of approach and saying, what is the variability of universality in neural responses across the different tasks? And also, how does the genetic variability influence the neural and the cultural variability, okay? So for this, we looked at diversity, not only in culture and brain, but thinking diversity or cultural diversity, biological diversity as adaptation. How can we understand that, okay? So most of, if not all of conventional evolutionary biology posits that natural selection plays a very important role in the expression of phenotypes, okay? And then there's also recent evidence of cultural niche construction. So this is an emerging theoretical work suggesting that, you know, individuals not only are individual behaviors are not only selected for, but that individuals also create environments that can best sort of interact with their genetic predispositions. So in this case, for example, in natural selection, you can see it's a process by which favorable traits become more common in successive generations. And so in this case, adaptation is the individual changes to fit the environment. And then in cultural niche construction, adaptation is defined as individuals changing environments to better fit the individual. So in this case, individuals who carry one or two sickle cell alleles are resistant to malaria, okay? So this has led to the greater theoretical development, I think, of this culture gene coevolutionary theory, okay, which I think a lot of people, you know, have really contributed to developing this particular theory. And what we did was we adopted this theory of culture gene coevolution, that these things are dynamic rather than static, right, to a particular case of the serotonin transporter gene and the cultural values of individualism collectivism. And what you could see here is basically that there is cultural variability in the frequency of the short allele across the world. And then there's also geographic variability in the degree of individualism and collectivism. And they map on very strongly. You can see this visually, but I'll show you quantitatively. And then we also looked at the phenotypes that the serotonin transporter gene is typically associated with, including anxiety and mood disorders. And you can see here. So this is the association between individualism and collectivism and the serotonin transporter gene. And then this is the association between this particular gene and anxiety and mood disorders, and individualism and collectivism and anxiety and mood disorders. Now, what's interesting is when you look within population, when you look, I'm not making strong claims about the particular type of population, okay? But when you take a within population approach, trying to control for cultural diversity, really, or ethnic diversity, what you essentially typically find is that this particular gene is associated with negative affects such as anxiety and mood disorders. But when you look cross populations, when you look across individualism and collectivism, you can see it's actually negatively correlated, okay? So that led us to another question, which was essentially, why would you see a negative correlation between a particular gene and a particular phenotype across culturally that you would not typically see within cultures, okay? So why would that be? And what we did is we tested a mediational model of the 5-HT gene predicting the endophenotype of anxiety and mood disorders as a function of individualism and collectivism. And basically what we found across nations was evidence that the frequency to which there was variability of the serotonin transporter gene negatively predicted prevalence of anxiety and mood disorders as a function of the prevalence of collectivism or individualism. So it's possible that collectivism evolved as a cultural value that essentially mediates the relationship between this particular gene, which leaves people vulnerable to negative affect, but then the cultural value system emerges in geographic regions where there's a large population of people with that particular genetic vulnerability and provides an environmental factor that protects them from that negative affect. And we also found that actually there was evidence that the environmental pressures also predict the degree or to which a particular region of the world is individualist or collectivistic, and that the serotonin transporter gene basically provides the genetic mechanism which produces that. So basically pathogen prevalence, the degree to which there is historical or modern pathogen prevalence across the world positively predicts individualism and collectivism. So collectivistic nations typically have greater historical pathogen prevalence. But it's mediated by the degree to which there's short allele carriers of the 5-HT. So this helps us to basically provide an evolutionary pressure story for how culture evolves, but then also an adaptive story or functional mechanistic story for why it would be that the cultural value would co-evolve with the particular gene frequency. And then we want to understand it from a theoretical level, so we basically say, well, what is the value of this particular knowledge in refining our understanding of emotional health in this particular case, but then in more broadly gene-environment interaction construed, okay? And what you can see here is really behavioral geneticists have looked at the relationship between gene and behavior, right? And then more recently, people have adopted the approach of endophenotypes or biomarkers that are intermediates between gene and behavior. And then these gene-environment interaction models basically look at neural activity and how neural activity predicts behavior. But if you're able to identify specific culture-gene associations or family of culture and family of gene associations, then you can basically interpret neural activity and behavior or neural and psychological process mappings as a function of these different types of culture-gene coevolutionary processes, okay? And so it helps us to refine gene-environment models of behavior by being more precise about what specific genetic factors and what specific environmental factors may predict this sort of endophenotype and phenotype response. And as we know from these elegant models by clinical psychologists and others who work in the gene-environment interaction models, any type of area of health, that the gene-environment interaction can work in multiple ways. You can see here that there can be an indirect effect of the gene on culture, and then culture affects neural activity, or culture can be affecting neural activity and the gene modulates that activity. Culture and gene can both indirectly affect neural activity, or one affects the other. So all of these models are just at this point theoretical, but I think that it would be exciting for us to look for really more mechanism and more precise specificity for how these complex pathways work. predict behavior. And so we can also see this, adopting the cultural psychologist perspective of the spectrum of universality, that essentially we can look at specific genes and also families of genes as we learn more about these particular gene behavior associations, we can map them on to these different types of levels or kinds of cultural diversity that we see in behavior and neural activity. So I like to just say that, diversity, it is possible that, in fact, diversity is not just something visible to us, that is, we see differences in other people that are visible phenotypically, but that it actually may have evolved as functions as an adaptation, so that we see diversity and cultural diversity, but this is a function of geographic or environmental pressures. And then finally, for this colloquium related to leadership in the collective good, I'd like to say that I think particularly for an American perspective, this can help us to understand diversity ideology, okay? So there's a debate, I think, a larger discourse within American public policy related to issues of color blindness versus multiculturalism, right? So do we, when people, who immigrate or emigrate into the country, right, do we adopt a colorblind perspective where they're essentially, all the same? Or do we adopt a perspective of multiculturalism where people are different, culturally different, but we embrace those differences? And this is a very complex question. But essentially this helps us, by understanding sort of what is at stake at these different levels of psychology as well as neuroscience, we can help to better understand what it means for communities, neighborhoods, nations to be diverse, and how best to respond to those needs of the community. Okay. So again, this is just to show you the empirical evidence related to cultural neuroscience and the ways in which we can adopt this framework to understand these larger scale problems. And there's been recent development within this particular emerging field. So there's been conceptual development, there's been community development, there's been a lot of efforts to sort of integrate communities, and then also pedagogical development. So in what ways can we provide courses and labs in training programs that enable students to basically learn these different types of theories and methods and adopt their own approaches, I think, to understanding these questions, okay? And then what are the implications for a behavioral and brain scientist? For us, it's exciting because we basically can create novel cultural theory based on these multi-level observations. Simultaneously, we can create novel neurobiological theory based on multi-level observations. More broadly, there's been lots of divides, I think, historically within institutions between the social and natural sciences, and they're very healthy, I think, because, it enables people to go deep into their questions, and it enables them to build communities that nurture that body of knowledge. But at the same time, sometimes it's good also to have synergy. So in what ways can we overlap? In what ways are there common questions that many different discourses can integrate and work together to solve? And additionally, from a population mental health perspective, we know that there's population differences in the likelihood of Tay-Sachs disease and cystic fibrosis. And as we, from at a national level and international level, think about how to respond to people's health concerns, how is it that we are able to create insights into the population differences underlying physical and mental health? And then from an interethnic ideology perspective, again, the role of cultural biological diversity in multi-ethnic societies. And finally, for the cultural good perspective, I adopt, I'm going to quote the readings of Jane Addams. So what, after all, has maintained the human race on the old globe, despite all calamities of nature and the tragic failings of mankind, if not for the faith in new possibilities and the courage to advocate for them? So with that, I leave you with those thoughts and open the floor to questions. Thank you.
That's fascinating. So I have a chicken egg question for you. How much of the interaction do you think is culture affecting the brain versus, or culture affecting the evolution versus evolution affecting culture? I mean, do you have any guesses on that yet?
No, I think it's very much a co-evolutionary perspective that we adopt. But at the same time, I think that it's open for debate. I think it's the empirical evidence of that is, there's been a lot of computational work on that culture gene co-evolutionary theory, and there's been a lot of efforts to integrate, I think, cultural evolutionary theory into the psychological framework. But I think, you know, the key thing is really like, what are some empirical cases in which we can really like empirically examine different types of culture gene associations, and then how they predict endophenotypes. I think that's the, you know, that's the goal. And ultimately, you know, really, anybody adopting a gene environment interaction approach, I think that they would want specificity in what types of environmental variables, what types of genetic variables, you know, are co-producing different types of endophenotypes. So, yeah.
I'm not sure what part of my brain was active while you were talking. Maybe not enough. I just want to make sure I understand. See, your study of people from traditional collectivist cultures, individual cultures, you didn't find that it matched. It matched their self-described level of individualism and collectivism. So if I'm an individualist, myself, locate the brain areas that are connected to the self are more active when I was thinking of myself in an individual context.
Culturally congruent.
Congruent,
Right.
okay. So when I was who I am across situations, those kinds of thoughts
Sure.
activated myself. But when I thought of more collective aspects,
Sure.
the self was physiologically quiet then, if I'm individualistic.
Yes. So this particular, right, so biologically you show greater response to, if you're an individualist, I think, to sort of more stimuli or environmental stimuli that says, in general, you know, I am this way across all contexts and situations, right?
Okay, and those areas were the prefrontal
BA 10 and 32. Yeah.
and what else do those areas do besides the self?
I think that there is, you know, it's a debate, I think, within the literature about what the, you know, what the functional significance is of these cortical midline structures. But I think it's really about resting state, you know, so it's really about endogenous versus exogenous attention. And, you know, again, this is an open question I think neuroscientists are asking. And, you know, I think that's why it's very much a synergistic dialogue. It's not something where it's just like, you know, one area or particular field of experts is going to be able to solve those problems necessarily. It's just that, you know, you really need to create an interdisciplinary dialogue, I think, to address these kinds of questions.
Okay, but it is an evolutionary newer area of the brain. The amygdala would be an older area.
No, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say that.
No? Okay. And in one of your, not to monopolize, sorry, but I'm selfish, you know, that's, you know, but I think it's for the greater good if I continue to be so. The response, and I think it was, I lost track of which study it was, but they were responding to fear faces.
Sure.
And you
yeah.
found that response in the amygdala for in-group members? Did you do angry faces? Did anger faces reverse and you found them more sensitive to out-group members?
I think that's a really good question, and I think particularly in cases of intergroup conflict, you would predict, and I think there's a lot of behavioral evidence to suggest that, you know, there's this divergent affective response as a function of in-group and out-group membership. In the cases of the neural responses that we found in that particular study, you know, we didn't see greater amygdala response to anger faces. Just greater response to in-group fear faces. So I think that, you know, it's very possible that this is a function of many different types of potential cascades. But, you know, I think that's why this is just work that needs to be continued and work that, you know, is just building. So I think that that's good.
Thank you.
When you were discussing how repetition priming is similar to cultural priming, I'm not really sure exactly what repetition priming is, but would that open the door to suggest that someone's cultural priming could be altered with some kind of I don't know, substitute repetition priming?
No, I mean, I don't really think so if I understand your question, you were asking whether or not cultural priming and repetition priming were congruent or incongruent types of conceptual ways of thinking about learning. And, and it's really, again, it's a debate in cognitive neuroscience, for example, what repetition priming is, and then how best to measure it, and whether different types of brain regions show responses to that. And I think from a cultural priming perspective, it's also, again, I think there's very elegant theory and methods suggesting that people have dynamic responses, and that the priming, essentially these different types of cultural information can modulate their behavior, but there's less. I think that we don't understand really yet the mechanism, right? So what is the mechanism underlying that? So it could be that, understanding it from a more learning and theory, learning and memory perspective will help us to sort of bridge those kinds of language gaps, I think, between those different types of fields. So, yeah.
So I teach a course on leadership in a diverse society. And what does this mean for learning and empathy toward other groups?
I think this is a really, really important question. And this is, I think, absolutely in the case where I think cultural and biological diversity, understanding the interplay of cultural and biological diversity play an important role in being able to understand people's emotional responses, particularly in the case of empathy, to pain and suffering relative to, non-pain suffering, and as well as their willingness to help, so how much time, money, effort do people give to help people? And I think you can see that there's like a lot of cultural and biological diversity that influences that empathy action cascade, but what's important, I think, to understand about that as well is that, typically when people think about the empathy altruism cascade, they think about Hamiltonian kin selection, so like people, are more likely to help people who are the same family members or kin. But really, when you think about it from a culture gene coevolutionary theory perspective, there are many different models that could predict basically the cascade or pathway from the emotional or the empathic response that people have to the suffering, and then their willingness to donate the time, the effort, and the money to alleviate the suffering of others. So I think that the data is still growing, but I think that it's very much the case where adopting a culture gene coevolutionary perspective is very helpful for understanding and refining empathy altruism theories.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.